They walked right into it, a trap set for an entire continent. But they did not break Mali, they broke themselves. On the morning of April 25, 2026, 6 major Malian cities detonated simultaneously. Hundreds of heavily armed insurgents, disguised in stolen military uniforms, converged on Assimi Goïta's primary command base in Kati. The international airport was paralyzed under heavy artillery fire. It was the most aggressive, synchronized decapitation strike West Africa has seen in a decade. But this was not a random surge of violence. Exactly 24 hours earlier, the Alliance of Sahel states declared a massive continental mobilization, 15,000 soldiers, ready to permanently seal their borders. The Extractive Framework panicked. They pulled the trigger on a shadow operation designed to dismantle the A's before it could even breathe. They expected the government to collapse. They expected the people to run. If you live anywhere on this planet and believe a nation's resources belong to its people, you must understand the blueprint of this attack, because this is exactly how the global establishment operates when it is finally cornered. In this video, we are going to expose the unseen puppet masters who forced deadly rivals to fight side by side against a sovereign state. We will reveal the counterintelligence masterstroke that kept Mali's leadership completely untouched by the blasts. And we will show you the ultimate nightmare of the neo-colonial machine, ordinary Malian citizens stepping onto the streets unarmed, refusing to let their homeland burn. The 24-hour trap failed. Let's look at the evidence. On April 24, 2026, the geopolitical tectonic plates of West Africa shifted forever. The military chiefs of staff from the Alliance of Sahel states gathered in Ouagadougou. They did not meet to discuss foreign aid. They did not meet to ask for permission. They met to finalize a unified defense structure. According to official declarations, the EAs announced the expansion of their joint military force from 6,000 to 15,000 troops. 15,000 soldiers, a unified command, a massive impenetrable shield stretching across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. This was no longer just a political statement. It was a physical wall. A wall built to permanently shut out the extractive framework, the shadowy network of external interests that has fed on the continent's instability for decades. A senior military official from Burkina Faso stood before the press and made it very clear. Anyone who threatens the AA space will face the full, devastating force of this unified army. What happens when a continent decides to stop taking orders? The answer arrived exactly 24 hours later. At approximately 5:20 in the morning, on April 25th, the silence in Mali was shattered. 2 massive explosions tore through the perimeter near the main military base at Kati. Kati is not just another facility. It is the nerve center of the Malian armed forces. It is the official residence of Assimi Goïta, the head of the transitional government. The extractive framework did not send diplomats, they sent fire. Simultaneously, heavy weapons fire erupted near the Modibo Keita International Airport in Bamako. The assault originated from near Base 101 in Sino, the military zone directly adjacent to the runways. Commercial flights were grounded instantly. Panic swept through the transit hubs. Army helicopters scrambled into the sky, initiating emergency patrols and conducting immediate airstrikes to contain the perimeter. But the attack was not contained to the capital. It was everywhere. Reports confirmed simultaneous, highly complex attacks across the country. In Sévaré, the strategic military hub connecting the south to the vast northern desert, in Gao, in Kidal, the historic heartland of northern separatist movements, and in Menaka, 6 major urban and military centers struck at the exact same time. Think about the geographical scale of this. Gao and Menaka are separated by vast hostile terrain from Bamako. To strike them all simultaneously means activating a nationwide network of deep cover operatives. This level of coordination costs millions of dollars. It demands satellite intelligence. This was not the work of disorganized insurgents. A scattered rebellion does not have the capacity to orchestrate a nationwide synchronized assault of this magnitude. This required months of careful staging. It required sophisticated supply chains. It required high-level intelligence and dark money flowing from unseen geopolitical puppet masters. Records indicate this was a calculated attempt to overwhelm the Malian state from every conceivable direction. The objective was absolute decapitation. The Malian armed forces did not remain silent as the country burned. They issued 2 official communiques directly to the public. The first communique firmly confirmed that unidentified armed groups had targeted military barracks in both the capital and the deep interior, and that sweeping counter-operations were actively underway. The second communique delivered the crushing blow to the invaders. It stated unequivocally that the situation was fully under control. Several of the attackers had been neutralized. Hundreds were arrested. Vast caches of equipment were seized or completely destroyed. The sweeping operations were clearing the streets, block by block. General Issa Coulibaly, the government spokesperson, appeared on state television. He stood unshakable. He confirmed that 16 people had been wounded, including civilians and military personnel. But he also projected a calm authority that defied the chaos the attackers sought to create. The governor of the Bamako district quickly announced a strict 3-day overnight curfew. They locked down the board, isolating the remaining insurgent assets. Western media outlets immediately began framing the chaos as proof that Mali's sovereign security model was collapsing. They ran headlines suggesting the situation was spiraling out of control, hinting that Mali needed to return to the old, failed security architectures of the past. But they left out the most critical detail, the detail that completely dismantled the framework's master plan. When the heavily armed strike teams breached the Kati military base, they expected to find the Malian leadership completely exposed. They planned to eliminate the architects of the AAs. They found empty rooms. Assimi Goïta was not at his residence when the explosions rocked Kati. Defense Minister Sadio Kamara was not at his home when it was reportedly targeted by a powerful blast. The key leadership of the Malian state was entirely absent from the kill zones. This was not luck. This was counterintelligence at its absolute finest. The Malian security apparatus knew. They had advanced awareness of the impending strike and took quiet, decisive measures to protect high-profile targets long before the first shot was fired. The attackers exhausted massive resources, burned their sleeper cells, and exposed their network, only to strike at shadows. The framework underestimated the intelligence capabilities of a sovereign African nation. They assumed Mali was blind. They were wrong. But as the smoke cleared over Bamako and Kati, the true nature of this assault began to reveal itself. The bodies of the captured and eliminated attackers were examined. And what the Malian armed forces discovered on those bodies sent shockwaves through the entire region. The Extractive Framework had not just sent armed factions. They had engineered a deception so dark, it changes how we must view every conflict on the continent. How did the Malian intelligence know exactly when and where the blow would fall? Documents reviewed from the aftermath reveal a chilling detail. The hundreds of attackers flooding into Bamako and Kati were not wearing rags. They were fully dressed in authentic Malian military uniforms. They infiltrated the population to butcher them from within. But who supplied the tactical gear? Who funded the elaborate camouflage designed to break the Malian military's trust in its own soldiers? In the next few minutes, we will expose the sinister alliance between deadly rivals and how the Extractive Framework armed them to the teeth. The deception was absolute. When the attackers breached the perimeters of Kati and Bamako, they did not look like insurgents. They looked like Malian soldiers. They wore the exact uniforms of the National Army. This was not a coincidence. This was psychological warfare. The Extractive Framework understands that to break a nation, you must first break its trust. By dressing their proxies in Malian uniforms, the architects of this attack wanted to create paralyzing confusion. They wanted Malian soldiers to hesitate before firing. They wanted civilians to fear the very army sworn to protect them. But acquiring hundreds of authentic combat uniforms requires vast resources. It requires deep infiltration. It requires a shadow supply chain that small, isolated factions simply do not possess. So who exactly were these attackers? According to public statements and verified monitoring groups, 2 distinct organizations formally claimed responsibility for the synchronized assault. The first is the Azawad Liberation Front. This is a coalition primarily fighting for a separate autonomous state in the northern regions of Mali. The second organization is NIM. This is a highly controversial armed faction with a long history of violence across the Sahel region. Read those names again: a separatist movement and a militant extremist faction. On paper, these two groups possess fundamentally incompatible ideologies. Their endgame is completely different. Their doctrines clash. Historically, they have fought against each other, just as fiercely as they have fought against the state. Yet, on the morning of April 25th, they executed a flawlessly synchronized, multi-front military operation. They fought side by side. Insurgent groups do not suddenly forget their blood feuds and launch a multi-million-dollar coordinated strike by accident. They are brought together. They are funded. They are armed. They are directed by a higher power. The extractive framework does not care about the ideology of the proxies it uses. It only cares about the result. And the result they desperately needed was the complete destruction of the alliance of Sahel states. Records indicate that this sinister alliance was forged purely out of geopolitical desperation. Since Assimi Goïta and his allies began systematically dismantling the neo-colonial architecture in the region, the framework has been bleeding influence. In January 2024, the Malian government made a monumental sovereign decision. They completely terminated the Algiers Accords. The international community immediately framed this as a reckless escalation. But documents suggest a very different reality. The accords were never fully implemented. They were a paralyzed framework designed to keep Mali permanently divided and dependent on external mediation. Goïta tore up the script. He rejected the endless cycle of foreign interference. He chose absolute sovereignty. The blueprint for this kind of destabilization is not new. If we look back at the historical timeline, a very similar pattern emerges. In 2012, a remarkably similar coalition of separatist forces and armed factions overran the northern territories of Mali. They captured major hubs like Timbuktu and Gao. The state lost control of nearly half its landmass. And what happened next? The external powers immediately swooped in as the saviors. They launched massive military interventions, embedding their own forces deep within Malian territory under the guise of security assistance. That was the old playbook. Create the crisis, fund the chaos, then step in to offer the solution, demanding control of the resources as payment. The framework expected this exact scenario to play out again in 2026. The termination of the Algiers Accords triggered a cascade of covert retaliation. From September 2025 to March 2026, these armed factions waged a brutal campaign of economic warfare against the Malian people. They orchestrated a massive fuel blockade. They destroyed over 300 tankers. They attempted to choke Bamako's critical supply routes. Petrol stations ran dry. Schools were forced to close. Power grids flickered under the strain of rolling blackouts. This was a deliberate strategy to starve the population into submission. They wanted the Malian citizens to turn against their own transitional government. They wanted the streets to erupt in protests demanding a return to the old subservient order. It did not work. The people endured. The government held its ground, and then the alliance of Sahel states made their historic announcement. 15,000 troops, a unified continental shield. The framework realized that economic strangulation was failing. They realized that time had officially run out. So they activated their ultimate contingency plan. They merged the separatists and the extremists into a single, heavily armed spearhead. We must examine a very specific statement released by the Azawad Liberation Front shortly after the attacks began. Their spokesperson did not just claim responsibility for striking military bases in Gao and Kidal. They issued a direct, explicit warning. They warned the governments of Burkina Faso and Niger to stay completely out of the ongoing events in Mali. Let that sink in. Why would a regional separatist group care about the military actions of neighboring countries? Why would they specifically name Burkina Faso and Niger? Because they were instructed to. Because this attack was never just about Mali. It was a direct, calculated assault on the mutual defense clause of the AAs. The extractive framework was using these proxies to test the waters. They wanted to see if the new alliance would fracture under pressure. They wanted to terrorize Burkina Faso and Niger into abandoning their Malian brothers. It was a stress test for African unity. And the framework threw everything they had at the walls of Bamako to see if they would crumble. They spent millions funding this unholy alliance. They provided satellite intelligence to map the 6 targeted cities. They supplied the tactical gear and the stolen uniforms to sow maximum chaos. They orchestrated the timing perfectly, striking just 24 hours after the AA's declaration to send a chilling message to the entire continent. The Extractive Framework believed they had engineered the perfect storm. They thought the Malian armed forces would collapse under the weight of a multi-directional siege. They thought the leadership would be eliminated. But the true shock of April 25th was not just who attacked, or the uniforms they wore while doing it. The true shock was what happened when the gunfire reached the residential streets. The Extractive Framework anticipated military resistance, but they never anticipated the people. Documents reviewed from the aftermath confirmed that the separatist factions and extremist militant groups shared the exact same encrypted communication channels during the siege. 2 sworn ideological enemies, seamlessly coordinated by a single unseen hand. We are about to uncover the ultimate nightmare of the Extractive Framework, the moment their multi-million-dollar proxy army was stopped dead in its tracks. Because when the gunfire echoed through the capital, the Malian military did not fight alone. Something unprecedented happened on the streets of Bamako. The Extractive Framework calculated every single military variable. They mapped the streets. They stole the combat uniforms. They synchronized the assault perfectly, pulling the trigger exactly 24 hours after the AA's expansion, just as we examined in the previous chapter. But they made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot the most dangerous element in any geopolitical equation. They forgot the people. And that mistake cost them everything. When the initial shock of the morning explosions finally subsided, the Malian armed forces initiated a devastating counteroffensive. They did not just push back, they brought fire from the sky. Mali currently operates one of the most highly capable drone fleets anywhere on the continent. They immediately deployed Turkish-made Bayraktar TB2s and heavy Akinci platforms to hunt the insurgents from above. This total air superiority was absolutely decisive. The attackers possessed the initial element of surprise. But the Malian military controlled the high ground. When the insurgents realized their decapitation strike had failed, they attempted to retreat deep into populated civilian neighborhoods. Their strategy was obvious. They wanted to use the Malian citizens as human shields. They wanted to force the government to destroy its own cities, to root them out. But the drones tracked their every frantic movement, isolating their positions with terrifying precision. But air power alone does not secure a sovereign nation. Ground forces must hold the front line. And this is precisely where the narrative transforms from a standard military defense into a historic masterclass in absolute African sovereignty. Security notes and raw local reports filtering out of Bamako and Kati described an extraordinary phenomenon, as the heavily armed insurgents, still wearing those stolen Malian uniforms, attempted to navigate the dense residential districts. The civilians did not run. They did not cower in their homes waiting for a foreign rescue that would never come. They stepped out. Men, women, even the youth. They poured onto the streets and physically confronted the attackers. Think about the immense, almost unimaginable courage this requires. These everyday citizens had no military-grade weapons. They were facing desperate, hardened extremists and separatist fighters armed to the teeth. In almost any other nation on Earth, a coordinated assault of this terrifying magnitude would trigger immediate mass panic and widespread civilian flight. The framework was counting on that exact panic. They needed the streets clogged with terrified refugees to paralyze the Malian military response. Instead, the citizens formed a human wall. They actively blocked the narrow streets. Refusing to let the proxy fighters advance any further, they assisted their own national military. They identified the disguised attackers attempting to blend into the chaotic crowds. They pointed out the safe houses where the insurgents tried to regroup. The military and the civilian population merged. They functioned flawlessly as a single, unbreakable organism to counter the invasion. This is what true sovereignty looks like. It is not simply a diplomatic word spoken at heavily guarded summits in foreign capitals. It is a living, breathing, unyielding principle defended with blood and sweat on the local streets. When we watch the Malian people stand their ground against a multi-million-dollar proxy army funded by the shadow architecture, we are not just distant spectators watching the news. We are directly witnessing the explosive rebirth of our own continental dignity. Their fierce resistance is our resistance. They are proving to the entire world that when a government actually serves its people, the people will gladly put their lives on the line to defend that government. The alliance of Sahel states is not just a military pact. It is a popular awakening. The attackers were completely overwhelmed by this unified front. The 24-hour trap completely collapsed. The grand coordinated strike that was meticulously designed to decapitate the state, fracture the A's, and burn Bamako to the ground ended in absolute disaster for the Extractive Framework. The Malian armed forces relentlessly hunted the remaining insurgents down. Block by grueling block, house by house, the government swept the 6 targeted cities. They secured the perimeters. The sweeping operations neutralized the immediate threat and resulted in hundreds of crucial arrests. The seized equipment and captured fighters will undoubtedly provide a treasure trove of intelligence detailing exactly who funded this assault. Assimi Goïta's leadership remained completely untouched. The defense minister remained secure. The Malian state did not bend. It stood tall. The Extractive Framework threw their absolute heaviest, most coordinated punch, and Mali simply absorbed it and broke the hand that threw it. This victory on the streets of Bamako and Kati sends a terrifying shockwave back to the capitals of the neo-colonial powers. They have spent decades pouring billions into psychological operations designed to convince Africans that they are inherently weak, divided, and dependent. The Extractive Framework's entire business model relies on that manufactured helplessness. When civilians run, the framework wins. When governments collapse in isolation, the framework wins. But what happens when the psychological programming breaks? What happens when a citizen looks at a heavily armed proxy fighter and feels defiance instead of fear? April 25th provided the answer. The machine short circuits. Let us look closer at the sheer scale of the framework's failure here. This was supposed to be their definitive show of force. They leveraged 2 completely opposing factions, armed them, dressed them, and gave them the exact coordinates of the nation's leadership. The plan was flawless on paper, but it failed because the old world order still fundamentally misunderstands the new African mindset. They still believe that African citizens view their militaries as oppressors. That was true under the old puppet regimes installed by foreign powers. But Assimi Goïta changed that paradigm. He expelled the foreign bases. He tore up the exploitative agreements. He gave the military back to the people. And on April 25th, the people returned the favor. They proved that no amount of foreign funding can defeat a nation that has finally remembered its own strength. The Extractive Framework expected panic, but they triggered an awakening they could never have planned for. The gunfire in Bamako had barely stopped, but according to time-stamped records, international headlines were already printed and published. Within mere hours, a synchronized narrative flooded the internet, perfectly aligned across multiple major Western networks. We are going to decode this massive psychological operation and show you exactly how the Extractive Framework desperately tried to weaponize the news. But you must ask yourself, how did these foreign journalists know exactly what to say before the Malian government even finished counting the captured attackers? The physical attack on April 25th was only the first half of the Extractive Framework's strategy. When the proxy forces failed to decapitate the state, the second phase was immediately activated, the psychological front. If you monitor the global news cycles immediately following the explosions in Kati, a terrifying pattern emerges. The speed and the absolute uniformity of the messaging go far beyond standard journalism. It looks exactly like a coordinated deployment. Within hours of the initial blasts, foreign media outlets and heavily sponsored geopolitical influencers converged on a single, identical narrative. They did not wait for facts. They did not wait for official casualty reports. They simply launched their pre-written scripts. The narrative was incredibly specific. They aggressively claimed that Mali's sovereign security model had completely collapsed. They flooded social media with declarative statements arguing that the new strategic partnerships in the Sahel had failed to protect the capital. And then they offered their solution. The same solution they have been selling for 60 years. They argued that the only way for Mali to survive was to abandon the alliance of Sahel states and return to the old, foreign-controlled security architecture. They wanted Mali to crawl back. They wanted Assimi Goïta to beg for the return of the very same foreign troops he had rightfully expelled. This is how the neo-colonial machine operates when it loses control of the ground. It attempts to control the mind. The extractive framework understands that they cannot physically conquer the AS with proxy armies alone. They need the African citizens to lose faith in their own leaders. They need the population to believe that sovereignty is too dangerous, too chaotic, and too expensive. But the media operation surrounding this specific attack exposes a glaring double standard. We must look at the exact language used by these foreign institutions. When the African Union, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and various foreign state departments issued their formal diplomatic condemnations, they explicitly used the highest terrorism designations. They recognized the horrific nature of a coordinated, multi-city assault designed to target civilians and overthrow a government. But the foreign media networks, the public mouthpieces of the extractive framework, deliberately avoided that designation. They softened the language. They called the attackers militants. They called them non-state actors. They called them armed factions. Think about the psychological manipulation embedded in those words. If a heavily armed insurgent group launched a simultaneous, six-city assault in Europe or North America, what would the headlines say? They would call it the darkest day of targeted violence in modern history. But when the exact same violence is unleashed upon an African nation refusing to bow to external pressure, the attackers are suddenly downgraded to mere militants. This linguistic gymnastics is entirely intentional. It is designed to legitimize the violence. It subtly suggests that the Malian government somehow deserves this instability. According to monitored digital traffic, an entire network of localized geopolitical influencers was activated almost simultaneously. These are voices that present themselves as objective African commentators. Yet they consistently echo the exact talking points generated in foreign capitals. Within minutes of the first explosions, they were already posting long, detailed analyses on social media platforms. They ignored the tactical reality on the ground. Instead, they loudly parroted the pre-approved conclusion that Mali was completely lost. Records indicate that this media campaign even mobilized regional proxies. Commentators from neighboring countries, specifically those whose governments remain closely aligned with the old colonial order, began publicly demanding foreign intervention in Mali. They pointed to the attacks and screamed that the Sahel was on the brink of a total apocalyptic collapse. They urged their own governments to step in and restore order. The irony is almost unbearable. Many of these commentators are broadcasting from countries where heavily armed groups currently control massive portions of their own sovereign territory. They speak from capitals that have completely failed to secure their own borders against relentless insurgent violence. Yet they suddenly claim the moral and military authority to fix Mali. They do not want to fix Mali. They want to contain the alliance of Sahel states. They are terrified that the Malian model of absolute defiance will spread across their own borders and awaken their own citizens. The extractive framework relies on the illusion of inevitability. They want you to believe that African nations are fundamentally incapable of surviving without foreign supervision. Whenever a sovereign African state builds a new defense structure, the framework immediately funds a crisis to test it. If the state struggles, the media broadcasts the struggle to the entire world, framing it as undeniable proof that independence was a tragic mistake. But the events of April 25th broke their narrative machine. They claimed the Malian military was weak, but the Malian forces maintained total air superiority, hunted down the proxies, and secured the capital in record time. They claimed the government was isolated, but the civilian population flooded the streets to fight side by side with their soldiers. They claimed the AS would fracture, but the exact opposite happened. The sheer scale and brutality of the coordinated assault proved to Burkina Faso and Niger exactly why the 15,000-strong unified army is an absolute necessity. The propaganda hit a wall of undeniable reality. You cannot convince a population that their government has failed when that population just watched their own military crush a multi-million-dollar invasion in less than 24 hours. The Extractive Framework spent a fortune attempting to orchestrate the perfect catastrophe. They weaponized separatists. They weaponized extremists. They weaponized the global press. They threw every single tool in their vast neo-colonial arsenal at the alliance of Sahel states. They expected this massive multi-tiered assault to be the final fatal blow against African independence. They believed their combination of physical terror and psychological manipulation was utterly invincible. They vastly underestimated the profound resilience of the people they sought to conquer. The 24-hour trap failed, but the real question is, what will the framework do now that their ultimate weapon is broken? The dust has finally settled over Bamako and Kati, but the shockwaves from April 25th will echo for generations. When we look back at the rubble of this failed invasion, three undeniable truths emerge from the smoke. First, the myth of African intelligence vulnerability has been permanently shattered. The Extractive Framework believed they could catch the Malian leadership sleeping. They believed they could orchestrate a massive, synchronized decapitation strike in the shadows. Instead, Assimi Goïta and his defense apparatus proved they were steps ahead, quietly relocating high-profile targets and turning the attacker's own master plan into a fatal trap. The era of blind African states is officially over. Second, the absolute desperation of the neo-colonial machine has finally been exposed to the entire world. We now have documented proof that the shadow architecture will fund, arm, and coordinate deadly ideological rivals, separatists and extremist factions, and force them to fight side by side just to tear down a sovereign African government. They do not care about stability. They only care about complete control. Third, and most importantly, we witness the ultimate weapon against foreign interference: the people. The framework spent millions of dollars calculating military variables, stealing uniforms, and synchronizing explosions. But they could never calculate the sheer, unbreakable willpower of everyday Malian citizens. When the civilians stepped out of their homes, unarmed, to stand shoulder to shoulder with their military, they built a wall that no amount of foreign money could ever breach. The Extractive Framework launched this coordinated assault exactly 24 hours after the alliance of Sahel states announced their unified 15,000-strong army. It was designed to be a brutal warning. It was meant to terrorize Burkina Faso and Niger into abandoning Mali. It was supposed to fracture the alliance before it even took its first breath. It achieved the exact opposite. The fires of April 25th did not burn down the alliance of Sahel states. They forged it in steel. Burkina Faso and Niger just watched Mali absorb the absolute hardest punch the neo-colonial machine could throw, and they watched Mali break the hand that threw it. The 15,000-strong unified force is no longer just a defensive concept. It is a proven, battle-tested necessity. The framework tried to break a nation, but they accidentally awakened an entire continent. This awakening is not just happening in the Sahel. It is happening right here, right now, in the minds of everyone listening to this message. The global establishment relies on silence and division to maintain their power. They want this story buried under their carefully crafted media narratives, but we have the power to break their algorithm. If this video changed how you see the resilience of Africa, do not just scroll past. Hit that like button to force this truth into the feeds of millions. Share this exact breakdown with anyone who still believes the mainstream lies about African sovereignty. And most importantly, we need to send a message that cannot be ignored. Drop the words "A's strong" in the comments right now if you stand with the ultimate defense of our continental homeland. Let them see our numbers. The 24-hour trap was just one battle in a much larger continent-wide war for economic and political survival. If you want to understand how the alliance of Sahel states is systematically dismantling the rest of the Extractive Framework's financial grip, you must watch the video appearing on your screen right now. Click it, and I will see you there.